Well, joining me now, Richard Hughes, trustee of the Western Front Association, an organisation which aims to spread more awareness about the history of the Great War. Richard, thanks very much indeed for joining us. First of all, what do you make of this little storm that's blown up here?
I think it's very unfortunate that, politics is intruding into this. I think one thing that we can all agree on is that the Great War, the First World War, should be remembered with dignity and decorum, and its fundamental importance in the life of this nation should be properly seen. I have some sympathy with the point of view that Max Arthur was making. I think critically, the Western Front Association wants to see the history of the First World War taught properly. And I think the serious point that Michael Gove is making is that if you teach history through the prism of Oh, What a Lovely War, Blackadder and the war poets, you get a particularly skewed version of what actually happened. Whereas if you dig to the better and the more academic history that is there to be read, there is a very different picture of the First World War. But
isn't he over-alarmed? I mean, surely any teacher who embarks upon teaching small children about the First World War is going to maybe show them Blackadder, but also explain to them the differences in our society that go back to that time and the massive changes that happened across Europe at the beginning of the 20th century.
I agree with you. I think if you're looking at a cultural history of the First World War, things like Blackadder have a perfect place. I mean, the soldiers of the First World War enjoyed satire, just as soldiers always does. There was a programme on recently about the Ypres newspaper, which used to satirise the position of the troops. Satire is important, and satire helps people get a point of view across. But satire is almost by definition a polemic. And it has to be seen within the greater scheme of accurate history.
In the big picture, I mean, do you sort of buy into these phrases like people who are left-wing are unpatriotic, and that politicians gather at the cenotaph? Some people are starting to object to that. They think they're kind of drumming up a sort of patriotism that doesn't really remember those that died in the First and Second Wars. It just keeps something going alive in terms of our attitude today about the armed forces. Where do you stand on that?
I think left-wing and right-wing are extremely misleading labels in the context of the history of the First World War. The terrible truth of the First World War is that men from every kind of background, and indeed women, lost their lives, from what we would call the posh to what we would call the people from the working classes. And that was the profound effect it had on this country. And the issue, I don't think, is whether history is left-wing or right-wing, it's whether it's right. And there is a lot of bad history out there, and there will be, inevitably, a lot of bad populist history in the next 4 years.
We're getting to the point as well where the First World War is becoming something that will be part of history rather than part of commemoration. And the Second World War, I suppose, as well. For example, we don't gather now and nod solemnly about the Battle of Waterloo, although the people in the First World War, to them, the Battle of Waterloo is something quite recent. I mean, these things go through a phase in our memories, don't they? How does your organisation approach that?
Strangely enough, I think with the sad sights that we see so often of soldiers coming home from Iraq and now Afghanistan, I think commemoration and remembrance has been thrown sharply back into focus. And I think it's very, very important to our armed forces that remembrance is done properly, and that it's done decently and it's done accurately, because remembrance or commemoration based on bad history is a sham.
Well, fair enough. But on the other hand, we are a nation in Europe who probably have the finest, most elaborate, most striking war memorials across our big cities. Is that sending us the right message, do you think, for the generations to come?
Yes, it is. I think it's a line in the sand. I think we would all agree that we should never forget what happened in the concentration camps in the Second World War. I think those memorials in the First World War are, again, a salutary reminder to this and to future generations about what can happen when politics and nationalism run out of control.
Speaking of satire, one thing I do remember, and both my parents and people of their generation were all actively involved as adults in the Second World War. Some of them suffered quite greatly, but they all enjoyed watching Dad's Army, which was a fond look at how the Second World War affected various people. Does that fall into the same category as Blackadder? I mean, should we be wary of humour remembering something?
I think Dad's Army wasn't really satire. It was much softer. It was a much gentler comedy. I think, to its credit, Blackadder had a much more visceral, biting edge, which is what made it so effective and I think so controversial. And I don't think anybody who saw Blackadder can ever forget the very last scene of the very last episode, when the whistle finally went and they didn't come back. So I think Blackadder and Dad's Army are in very, very different categories.
But that was a poignant message at the end of Blackadder. We are out of time, Richard, but how would you like children nowadays to walk away, after this year where they will be inundated with material about the First World War, what would you like them to walk away with from that?
I would like them to walk away with a profound sense of gratitude for the generations that went before them. And I think if there is a proper understanding of that history, and indeed the history of the Second World War, then I think it gives us as a country our national bearings. There's an old saying in history, you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. And I think that's why it's so important.
Fair enough. Richard, thanks very much indeed for joining us this evening on Sky News. Pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure. Thank you.